At 1:43 in the morning, the destroyer Patterson sent out a warning. "Warning! Warning! Strange ships entering the harbor!" But by the time that message went out, the first torpedoes were already on their way. Less than 40 minutes later, 4 Allied cruisers had been reduced to burning wrecks off Guadalcanal. To understand why Patterson's warning came too late, we need to go back to the moment when the United States believed it finally had a chance to go on the offensive. Many people see the Battle of Midway as the Japanese Navy's final high point as a formidable fighting force. But that is not accurate. Japan had suffered a major defeat, but it was still far from being completely defeated. Its main carrier force had just suffered a devastating loss, while its surface fleet, particularly its heavy cruisers, remained an extremely dangerous opponent. After Midway, Admiral Ernest King realized that the United States had an opportunity to seize the initiative. He identified the South Pacific as the right place to begin and ordered preparations for an operation to retake Tulagi, the seaplane base Japan had established in May 1942. The original plan called for the landing to take place in the fall, but on July 2nd, American intelligence discovered that the Japanese were building an airfield across Savo Sound on the island of Guadalcanal. From that position, Japanese aircraft could threaten the shipping lanes and lines of communication between the United States and Australia. The objective was no longer just Tulagi. American forces had to seize Guadalcanal before the airfield became operational. Operation Watchtower was moved forward to early August. Preparations took less than a month, giving the entire operation a rushed and improvised character. Despite the limited time and mounting logistical difficulties, by the end of July, the expeditionary force had begun its journey toward the Solomon Islands, carrying nearly 19,000 Marines. Bad weather concealed the fleet from enemy reconnaissance. As a result, when American forces entered the Tulagi and Guadalcanal area on the morning of August 7th, the Japanese were taken completely by surprise. After air and naval bombardments, the 1st Marine Division began landing. On Guadalcanal, the Japanese presence consisted mainly of construction crews and laborers working on the unfinished airfield. When the Marines moved inland, the Japanese withdrew into the jungle. At Tulagi and the 2 smaller islands of Gavutu and Tanambogo, the Japanese put up much stronger resistance. All the objectives were eventually captured, but only after intense fighting. While the landings were underway, the main Japanese fleet base at Rabaul began receiving urgent messages from Tulagi. The first report stated, "Enemy task force sighted." An hour later, a second message reported that the base was under bombardment and that American troops were preparing to land. Then, at 8:05 a.m., the final message was transmitted. "Enemy forces overwhelming. We will defend this position to the death. May victory be everlasting." After that, the communication station at Tulagi went completely silent. The Japanese response came almost immediately. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, 53, was the commander of the newly formed 8th Fleet. When he learned that Tulagi and Guadalcanal were under attack, he immediately sent reconnaissance aircraft to gather more information and ordered every available warship to concentrate at Rabaul. The first reports quickly made it clear that this was not a minor raid. The Americans were carrying out a large-scale amphibious operation involving transports and cruisers, with aircraft carriers providing support. Mikawa had no carriers of his own. If he approached Guadalcanal in daylight, his force could be detected and attacked by American aircraft before reaching its target. So he decided to strike at night. Mikawa later explained, "I chose night operations because I had no air cover. Had I not attacked at night, reliable air support would have been indispensable. On the other hand, I had complete confidence in my ships. The Japanese Navy's emphasis on training and practice in night fighting would give us a chance of success, even without air support." The plan depended on speed, darkness, and surprise. The Japanese force would move down New Georgia Sound, the route later known as the Slot, past Savo Island after nightfall, launch a rapid attack against the Allied forces, and withdraw north before dawn. The Naval General Staff initially objected, believing Mikawa was risking too many warships without air cover, but if no counterattack was made, the Americans would have time to reinforce their beachhead and bring the Guadalcanal airfield into operation. The plan was ultimately approved. Mikawa boarded his flagship, Chokai, and assembled a force consisting of the heavy cruisers Aoba, Kako, Kinugasa, and Furutaka, the light cruisers Tenryu and Yubari, and the destroyer Unagi. These 8 warships were not a large force compared with the total number of Allied ships around Guadalcanal, but the Japanese cruisers carried powerful guns, long-range torpedoes, and crews that had undergone extensive training in night combat. The problem was that most of the ships had never operated together as a single fighting formation. There was no time to coordinate anything complicated, so Mikawa decided to place the entire force in a single column and keep the plan as simple as possible. The ships would pass south of Savo Island, use torpedoes and gunfire against the main Allied force off Guadalcanal, then continue toward the anchorage at Tulagi before withdrawing to the north. Mikawa also ordered all unnecessary flammable materials thrown overboard. In a close-range night battle, a single shell striking gasoline, paint, or wood stored on deck could turn an entire warship into a torch. On the afternoon of August 8th, the 8 ships formed a single column and began moving down the slot toward Guadalcanal. While Mikawa's force advanced, the Allied landings continued under pressure from Japanese aircraft. On August 7th, planes operating from Rabaul were redirected to attack the ships in the Sound, but Allied forces had received warning from coast watchers and had time to prepare. Forced to bomb from high altitude through heavy cloud cover, the Japanese caused no significant damage. A later dive bomber attack managed only a minor hit on a destroyer. The attack the following day was far more dangerous. On the morning of August 8th, Betty torpedo bombers took off from Rabaul. Their original mission was to locate the American carriers, but when they failed to find them, the formation turned toward the transports anchored around Guadalcanal. Near midday, the Japanese aircraft dropped to low altitude and began their attack. Only a small number of American fighters were in position to intercept. For a few moments, the torpedo bombers had a nearly clear run at the ships in the Sound. The Allied warships immediately threw up a dense wall of anti-aircraft fire. Because the Bettys had to fly close to the surface to release their torpedoes, they became targets for nearly every weapon aboard the ships. One after another, they were shot down. One badly damaged aircraft crashed into the transport George F. Elliott, starting a fire so severe that the ship eventually had to be scuttled. Another torpedo struck the destroyer Jarvis. The explosion tore a large hole in her starboard side, leaving her bow low in the water. Jarvis remained afloat, but she was badly damaged, and her radio no longer worked. The attack ended after only about 10 minutes. Most of the Allied warships and transports remained intact, while the Japanese attackers suffered extremely heavy losses. But the report sent back to Rabaul described a completely different result. The pilots claimed to have sunk 14 ships and heavily damaged 3 more. That information quickly reached Mikawa, giving him reason to believe that the Allied force at Guadalcanal had already been severely weakened before his cruisers arrived. In reality, the most important consequence of the 2 days of air attacks was not the number of ships hit. Allied sailors had spent hour after hour protecting the landings, fighting off Japanese aircraft, and remaining at battle stations. By the evening of August 8th, many had received almost no rest. When the threat from the air temporarily eased, the number of men at battle stations was reduced. Those who were not on watch were finally allowed to sleep. At the same time, the Japanese column was moving deeper down the slot. Mikawa's fleet was not invisible. During its approach to Guadalcanal, the Japanese force was sighted several times, but every report had a different problem: incomplete information, mistaken identification, or delays that made it useless by the time it arrived. The first sighting occurred on August 7th, when the American submarine S-38 observed a force of Japanese warships moving southeast. A report was transmitted, but the direction of travel was not enough to prove that Mikawa was heading for Guadalcanal. The Japanese fleet could have been moving toward Cavien, Buka, or another base in the region. The information, therefore, led to no significant change in the Allied defensive posture. The most important sighting occurred on the morning of August 8th. At 10:25 a.m., an Australian reconnaissance aircraft spotted Mikawa's formation moving southeast. The crew immediately transmitted a report, but received no acknowledgement from the base, so the pilot decided to return and report in person. The aircraft landed at 12:42 p.m. The information should have been passed immediately to Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commander of the amphibious force at Guadalcanal. But the reconnaissance units operating in the area belonged to a different command structure from the forces conducting Operation Watchtower. Because the operation had been kept secret, many pilots and officers at the base had not been told that a major landing was underway at Guadalcanal. They did not know that any warships moving southeast could represent a direct threat. The officer who debriefed the crew therefore did not regard the report as urgent. Instead of being sent directly to Turner, the report went through the normal channels, passing through a series of bases and communication centers. It reached Townsville early that afternoon, remained there for more than 3 hours, then was forwarded through Brisbane, Canberra, and Pearl Harbor before being transmitted back to the warships at Guadalcanal. Information that could have been sent in a matter of minutes took more than 8 hours to reach the people who needed it. The delay was even more dangerous because the aircrew had misidentified the Japanese formation. The report described the enemy force as 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and 2 seaplane tenders. In reality, Mikawa was leading 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 1 destroyer. Not long after the 10:25 sighting, another aircraft also spotted the Japanese fleet. This second report might have made up for the earlier delay, but it too was handled as routine information rather than an urgent warning. Turner did not receive it until 9:30 p.m., when it was already more than 10 hours old. He was forced to assess the situation using information that was both late and wrong. The detail that most heavily influenced Turner's judgment was the presence of the 2 seaplane tenders mentioned in the report. If they were really there, the Japanese might be preparing to establish another seaplane base, with the cruisers and destroyers acting only as escorts. Such a force did not appear likely to charge down the slot and attack the entire Allied fleet during the night. Turner did not know that the 2 seaplane tenders were actually cruisers that had been misidentified, nor did he know how much confidence Mikawa placed in his force's ability to fight at night. Even so, Turner did not completely ignore the northwestern approach. He understood that if the Japanese intended to reach Guadalcanal, the most logical route was down the slot. He therefore ordered an afternoon reconnaissance flight to search the area. Had the mission taken place, the aircraft probably would have found Mikawa still heading south. But the order never reached the unit responsible for carrying it out. No reconnaissance flight was made. Turner did not know that. He believed the area had been searched and took the absence of any report as evidence that the Japanese force was no longer moving toward Guadalcanal. It was not until nearly midnight that Turner learned the slot had never been searched that afternoon. By then, what he had believed to be confirmed had suddenly become a complete unknown. The Japanese force might have changed course. The original report about the seaplane tenders might have been correct, but it was also possible that Mikawa was still moving south. Turner did not have enough information to know which possibility was true. Even so, he maintained his judgment that the Japanese were probably carrying out some other mission rather than preparing a night attack on Savo Sound. The cruiser commanders therefore received no new warning clear enough to prompt them to raise their readiness level. Turner also believed that if the Japanese did appear, the force protecting the transports was strong enough to handle them. He later admitted, "I was satisfied with the disposition and hoped the enemy would attack. I believed they would receive a warm reception." That judgment was not the result of Turner simply ignoring the danger. He had ordered reconnaissance of the most dangerous approach. But the mission never took place, even though he believed it had. The report he received described a force entirely different from Mikawa's actual formation. From the silence of a flight that had never taken off and a false picture of the enemy, Turner concluded that the risk of a night attack was very low. The cruisers around Savo Island continued their patrols, unaware that 8 Japanese warships had already covered most of the remaining distance. On paper, the Allied force around Savo Island was entirely capable of dealing with Mikawa. Turner's transports were protected by 6 American and Australian cruisers and several destroyers under Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley. But to guard the different approaches, the force had been divided into several separate groups. South of Savo Island were the Australian cruiser Canberra, the American cruiser Chicago, and the destroyers Patterson and Bagley. Crutchley's flagship, the Australian cruiser Australia, had originally operated with this group as well. To the north were the American cruisers Vincennes, Quincy, and Astoria, escorted by the destroyers Wilson and Helm. Another group was stationed to the east, but it was too far from Mikawa's route to intervene in the coming battle. The outer screen was even thinner. Most of the destroyers had to remain close to the transports as protection against submarines, so only Blue and Ralph Talbot patrolled the northwestern approach. The 2 ships had been selected because they were considered particularly effective at using search radar. The Allies believed radar would allow them to detect the enemy at long range in the darkness. But the technology was still relatively new. Experience in using it was limited, and the terrain around Savo Island could mask targets or create radar clutter. More importantly, the patrol routes of Blue and Ralph Talbot left an enormous gap. At their farthest separation, the two destroyers could be more than 30 kilometers apart. Mikawa's route took the Japanese column directly through that gap. After 2 continuous days of protecting the landings and fighting off air attacks, the Allied warships were shifted to Condition 2. Only some battle stations and gun batteries remained manned. The rest of the crews were finally allowed to rest. That same night, the commander of the entire cruiser force left the formation. At 8:55 p.m., Turner summoned Crutchley to a meeting to discuss the progress of the landings and the withdrawal of the American aircraft carriers. Crutchley took his flagship, Australia, out of the southern group. Before leaving, he signaled Captain Howard Bode aboard Chicago. "Take charge of the patrol. I may return later." But that message was never sent to Captain Frederick Reefcohl, commander of the northern group. Bode initially intended to move Chicago ahead of Canberra and personally lead the formation, but maneuvering a large cruiser in darkness always carried a risk of collision, so he decided to wait for Crutchley to return. Crutchley did not return that night. Australia remained with Turner, while Chicago stayed near the rear of the southern formation. By rank, Reefcohl was now the senior officer remaining with the cruiser force, but he did not know Crutchley had left, and he did not know that Bode had temporarily assumed command of the southern group. If an attack came, the two cruiser groups would not act under a single command. Outside, Blue and Ralph Talbot patrolled widely separated routes. Inside, the cruiser force had been divided into 2 groups, with only part of their crews at battle stations. When Mikawa entered the Sound, no officer was truly commanding the entire Allied cruiser force. The sun set at 6:16 p.m. The air attack Mikawa had feared throughout the voyage never came. As darkness settled over the slot, the 8 Japanese warships continued toward Guadalcanal in a single column. At 11:13 p.m., 3 floatplanes were launched ahead of the formation. Once the battle began, they would drop flares over the anchorage to help the Japanese ships identify their targets. Below, lookouts searched constantly through the darkness. At 12:43 a.m., they spotted an enemy warship at a distance of more than 8 kilometers. It was the destroyer Blue, one of the 2 ships patrolling the northwestern screen. The Japanese formation immediately slowed and changed course. Dozens of guns trained on the lone ship, ready to fire if it raised the alarm. Mikawa chose to remain silent. Blue continued along her patrol route without reacting, then slowly moved away from the Japanese formation. Without firing a shot, Mikawa had passed the first defensive screen and entered the gap between Blue and Ralph Talbot. He increased speed to 26 knots. As the Japanese force passed south of Savo Island, another warship suddenly appeared off the port side. It was Jarvis. The destroyer had been struck by a torpedo during the previous day's air attack. Her bow rode low in the water, her speed was restricted, and her radio no longer worked. Now she was on a course that nearly cut across Mikawa's formation. Jarvis came very close to the Japanese ships, but she did not sound the alarm. It is unclear whether anyone aboard recognized the enemy. The ship was badly damaged, and her crew had just endured 2 days of continuous fighting. Once again, Mikawa did not open fire. Unagi, the last ship in the column, broke away to watch Jarvis while the rest of the force continued deeper into the Sound. At 1:33 a.m., Mikawa gave the order. "All ships, attack!" Only minutes later, Japanese lookouts saw 2 large silhouettes ahead. They were Canberra and Chicago, part of the Southern Patrol Group. The torpedo tubes swung toward the targets. Above them came the sound of Japanese floatplane engines. Some Allied sailors heard the aircraft but assumed they were friendly aircraft on night patrol, so no alarm was raised. Chokai launched the first spread of torpedoes. In the darkness, the weapons raced toward cruisers whose crews still had no idea what was happening. At 1:43 a.m., the destroyer Patterson finally spotted the strange warships and transmitted her warning. "Warning! Warning! Strange ships entering the harbor!" But the torpedoes were already on their way. Only seconds later, the Japanese floatplanes dropped flares. White light poured across the surface of the sea, clearly revealing the Allied formation. Chokai opened fire. The ships behind her immediately followed. Their first target was Canberra. The range was barely more than 4 kilometers. Chokai fired first, and then the entire Japanese column opened fire together. their guns concentrated on Canberra, the leading cruiser of the southern group. A storm of shells crashed into the ship's port side. Canberra turned hard to starboard, trying to place herself between the enemy and the transports. But before her main guns could respond effectively, dozens of shells had struck amidships, the bridge, and the engineering spaces. Electrical power failed. The engine rooms became inoperable. Captain Frank Getting was mortally wounded, while water poured through holes near the waterline. Within minutes, Canberra lay dead in the water, listing and burning. There is still debate over whether the ship was also struck by a torpedo fired by the destroyer Bagley, but there is not enough evidence to reach a firm conclusion, and the Japanese gunfire alone was enough to knock Canberra out of the battle almost immediately. Behind her, Chicago turned as torpedo wakes came into view. The cruiser avoided most of the attack, but one torpedo struck the starboard side near the bow. The explosion caused flooding and left her bow riding low in the water, though Chicago retained most of her fighting ability. Moments later, a shell struck the foremast. In the light of the flares, gunfire came from several directions, while ship silhouettes were visible in several others, preventing Chicago's bridge crew from quickly determining the scale of the attack. Her main battery never managed to fire, but the secondary guns hit Tenryu and caused Japanese casualties. Chicago then turned west. Captain Howard Bode believed he was moving toward another source of gunfire, probably the engagement between Unagi and Jarvis. But that course also took Chicago away from the main body of Mikawa's force. At the edge of the battlefield, Jarvis continued fighting despite the heavy damage he had suffered the day before. When Unagi closed in, the American destroyer opened heavy fire, forcing Unagi to break away from the main attack and eventually withdraw. Bagley also turned sharply and launched torpedoes toward the Japanese silhouettes. But in the confusion of the night battle, none were confirmed to have hit. Patterson was the quickest Allied ship to react. After sending the warning, the destroyer immediately opened fire on Tenryu and Yubari. She fought almost alone while Canberra lay disabled and Chicago was changing course. A Japanese shell then struck Patterson's aftergun mount, causing casualties and forcing the destroyer to leave the area. Within roughly 6 minutes, the southern group had lost any ability to organize a coordinated response. Canberra was dead in the water and burning fiercely. Chicago could still fight, but had moved away from the enemy's main line of advance. The two escorting destroyers could not prevent the Japanese formation from continuing into the Sound. The most damaging consequence was that the northern group received no clear report from Chicago. Bode knew a Japanese surface force had entered the Sound and crushed his group, but Vincennes, Quincy, and Astoria were never fully informed of its composition, direction, or the danger it represented. North of Savo Island, Captain Frederick Reefcoal heard gunfire but did not know exactly what was happening. He did not want to abandon his position because the transports behind him still needed protection. The northern group therefore continued its patrol and waited for orders from Crutchley. Those orders never came. While Reefcoal was still trying to understand the situation, Mikawa saw the 3 American cruisers ahead and adjusted course toward them. The northern group continued northwest, almost completely unaware of what had just happened south of Savo Island. Patterson's warning had been transmitted, but it arrived while the ships were exchanging signals and changing course. Vincennes received the message, but it was never passed to Captain Reefcoal. Quincy received it as well. Astoria did not receive it at all. So after nearly 10 minutes of fighting, the 3 northern cruisers still did not know that a Japanese force was heading straight toward them. During the attack on the southern group, Mikawa's formation had become disorganized and separated into 2 wings. Chokai, Aoba, Kako, and Kinugasa moved in one direction, while Furutaka, Tenryu, and Yubari moved in the other. That unplanned separation accidentally placed the American cruisers in an even more dangerous position. Vincennes, Quincy, and Astoria were now caught between attacks coming from 2 directions, while their guns were still not fully prepared to respond. Japanese searchlights came on and shone directly into the northern formation. On the American decks, sailors began running toward their battle stations as the alarm finally sounded. But even then, many still believed the ships shining searchlights on them were friendly. Vincennes repeatedly signaled, "Turn off your searchlights. We are friendly ships." The first shells began falling around Astoria. Her gunners reacted quickly and opened fire, but Captain William Greenman had just awakened. When he reached the bridge, he ordered them to stop. He feared the ship was firing on Allied forces. After a brief hesitation, Greenman was convinced that the silhouettes ahead really were enemy ships. The order to resume fire was given, but Chokai had already gained the advantage. Shell after shell struck Astoria's bow, gun deck, and bridge. 2 turrets were disabled, and then the floatplane hangar was hit and burst into flames. The American cruisers carried floatplanes amidships, surrounded by aviation gasoline, lubricating oil, ammunition, and other flammable materials. Once this area was hit, the fire spread rapidly, lighting up the ship and giving the Japanese gunners a clear target. The forward engine room had to be abandoned. Astoria gradually lost the ability to maneuver and nearly collided with Quincy, which was also under heavy fire nearby. Quincy was first hit by Aoba, then spotted more Japanese targets off her port side. The cruiser turned to starboard as torpedoes approached, but she could not avoid them all. 2 struck the hull. Shells then poured in from both directions. The after turret was destroyed, the floatplane catapult was hit, and the aircraft aboard the ship burst into flames. Quincy's stern sank low in the water, but the cruiser continued to fight back. She managed to fire only 3 main battery salvos during the entire battle. The last struck Chokai's bridge, passing close to Mikawa and his staff and destroying charts and equipment. It was the most dangerous counterblow the Allied force delivered that night. But Quincy had no time to take advantage of it. Her own bridge was struck. Captain Samuel Moore was killed, and another torpedo hit the starboard side, destroying what remained of the ship's propulsion. Quincy continued burning and began to lose control. At the head of the northern formation, Vincennes was also hit in the opening minutes. 2 torpedoes from Chokai struck her port side while shells from both Japanese wings continued to rain down. Vincennes returned fire and hit Kinugasa, causing minor damage. But that was nearly all the harm she managed to inflict. 1 turret after another was disabled. The main steam line, firefighting system, and fire control equipment were destroyed. The bridge was hit, throwing communications aboard the ship into chaos, while the floatplane area began to burn. When steering and electrical power failed, Vincennes could no longer control her course, coordinate her gunfire, or fight the fires spreading across the ship. The destroyers Wilson and Helm tried to return fire, but had little effect. Helm fired 1 salvo and then lost the target in the darkness. Wilson continued firing at several Japanese ships, but recorded no hits. Following the plan, Mikawa's force began withdrawing from the area. Behind them, Astoria, Quincy, and Vincennes were still burning. The fires were so intense that the Japanese no longer needed searchlights to aim. The burning ships themselves illuminated the entire battle area. During the withdrawal, the Japanese cruisers encountered the screening destroyer Ralph Talbot. Yubari, Tenryu, and Furutaka immediately opened fire, hitting the ship several times and starting fires. Ralph Talbot fired back but could not hit the enemy. Just as the destroyer faced destruction, a sudden rain squall swept across the area and concealed her from the Japanese gunners. Mikawa's force lost sight of the target and continued north. At about 2:20 a.m., the order to cease fire was given. The gunfire gradually faded as the Japanese ships left the Sound with relatively minor damage. Behind them, the cruiser force protecting the Allied transports had been crushed. But the transports were still intact. Mikawa now had to decide whether to turn back. The force defending the transports had been defeated. The Japanese ships still carried enough shells and torpedoes to continue fighting, while the transports loaded with troops, food, ammunition, and equipment for the forces on Guadalcanal were now almost completely unprotected. If Mikawa turned back, he stood a strong chance of delivering a blow with major strategic consequences. But after the chaotic battle, the Japanese formation had scattered. To return to the anchorage, the ships would first have to regroup, reverse course, and enter the confined waters around Savo Island again. The shell from Quincy that struck Chokai's bridge had also destroyed charts and equipment needed for safe navigation. More importantly, dawn was approaching. Mikawa estimated that his force would need about an hour and a half to regroup and turn back, followed by more time to approach the transports. Even under favorable conditions, the attack would probably not begin until around 5 in the morning. By then, only a short period of darkness would remain. If he continued, the Japanese cruisers would have to withdraw in daylight without air cover. Mikawa still believed American aircraft carriers were operating somewhere near Guadalcanal, ready to attack his surface force once the sun came up. He had to choose between a tremendous opportunity and the risk of losing most of the force he had. From approximately 2:15 to 2:23 a.m., Mikawa and his staff considered the situation. In the end, he decided to withdraw. At 2:23 a.m., the entire force was ordered to continue north. But the American carriers, Mikawa feared, had actually left the area the previous evening. Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, concerned about his remaining aircraft fuel levels and the threat from Japanese land-based aviation, had ordered the carrier force to withdraw. Had Mikawa turned back, he probably would not have faced the air counterattack he expected. The transports, along with most of the supplies that had not yet been unloaded, might have been destroyed. But Mikawa had no way of knowing the truth that night. All he knew was that his formation had scattered, his charts were damaged, the sun would soon rise, and the American carriers might still be waiting offshore. With the information available to him, he chose to preserve his force and was satisfied with the victory he had already won. The Japanese cruisers continued moving away from Savo Island. Behind them, the burning Allied warships began sinking one after another. When the Japanese ships disappeared to the north, the surface battle was over. But for the ships burning around Savo Island, the struggle to survive had only begun. Quincy was the first to be lost. The ship rapidly listed to port, her stern sinking deep into the water as fires continued spreading across the deck. The order to abandon ship was given, but many sailors were trapped below or could not hear it amid the explosions and heavy smoke. At 2:38 a.m., Quincy rolled over and sank. About 370 men were killed, including Captain Samuel Moore. Vincennes remained afloat for nearly an hour after being hit, but she was beyond saving. The ship had no power. Steering had failed. Many compartments below were flooded, and the fires continued advancing toward the magazines. Captain Frederick Reefcole ordered the crew to abandon ship. Destroyers moved in to rescue survivors as Vincennes developed an increasingly severe list. At around 2:50 a.m., the ship rolled to port and sank, taking 332 men with her. Canberra remained motionless south of Savo Island. The cruiser had lost propulsion. Water was flooding several compartments, and she could not leave the area under her own power. Damage control teams tried to contain the fires and keep her afloat, but the flooding continued to worsen. The destroyers Patterson and Blue came alongside to remove the wounded and most of the crew. A total of 84 men aboard Canberra had been killed. Turner could not leave a disabled cruiser in the path of the withdrawing transports. When there was no longer any hope of saving her, Canberra was ordered scuttled. Torpedoes and shell fire finally ended the ship's life on the morning of August 9th. Astoria was the only one of the 3 Northern American cruisers still afloat after sunrise. For hours, rescue parties fought the fires and flooding. Some of the fires were brought under control, tow lines were passed to a destroyer, and for a time it seemed Astoria might still be saved. But the internal damage was too severe. Water continued pouring through shattered bulkheads, causing the ship to list further and settle deeper. By late morning, the situation was beyond control. The remaining men were ordered off the ship. Astoria rolled over and sank at 12:15 p.m., nearly 10 hours after the first shells had struck her. Of her crew, 216 men were killed. In a single night, more than 1,000 Allied sailors were killed. Hundreds more were wounded, badly burned, or left waiting in the water for hours before they could be rescued. Japanese losses were far smaller. Chokai had suffered damage to her bridge, and Kinugasa and several other ships had been hit, but all of Mikawa's ships were still able to withdraw north under their own power. For Turner, the loss of the cruiser force made it too dangerous to keep the transports off Guadalcanal. Even before the battle, Fletcher's withdrawal of the carriers had shortened the time available to support the landings. Turner had already expected to remove the transports after unloading the most essential supplies before Japanese aircraft from Rabaul could return. The disaster at Savo did not cause the decision to withdraw, but it made remaining in the area nearly impossible. The surface force protecting the transports had just been destroyed. Many of the surviving warships were rescuing men or escorting damaged ships, and another air attack could come at any time. Unloading was therefore stopped while large amounts of food, ammunition, fuel, and equipment remained aboard the transports. On August 9th, the transports began leaving Guadalcanal. On shore, nearly 17,000 Marines were left behind with limited supplies. Much of their heavy equipment had not been unloaded, rations had to be restricted, and the available ammunition and fuel would support only a short campaign if the Japanese launched a strong counterattack. The landing had succeeded. The unfinished airfield was in American hands. But the troops on the island were now isolated, without carrier protection, and with only part of the supplies they needed to hold the beachhead. From the beaches of Guadalcanal, the Marines watched the transports slowly disappear beyond the horizon. No one knew when they might return. Behind them, columns of smoke from the sunken warships still hung over the waters around Savo Island. For the Japanese Navy, the Battle of Savo Island was an almost complete tactical victory. Mikawa's force had passed through the screening line, destroyed 2 Allied cruiser groups, and withdrawn with relatively little damage. The raid demonstrated the effectiveness of the Japanese Navy's night combat training, target identification, and close-range use of torpedoes. The Allied defeat did not result from one isolated mistake. The Japanese fleet had been sighted, but the reports arrived late and misidentified the enemy force. The most important reconnaissance flight was never carried out, while Turner believed the area had been searched. The ships protecting the transports had been divided into separate groups, and their overall commander had left the formation without establishing a clear replacement command structure. When the battle began, those failures forced the Allied ships to react individually, without a common picture of the enemy and without unified orders. Yet Mikawa's victory failed to achieve the most important strategic objective. The transports remained intact. Although they withdrew before unloading all their cargo, they had already landed nearly 17,000 Marines on Guadalcanal and left behind enough troops to hold the unfinished airfield. The Americans quickly completed the airfield and named it Henderson Field. From there, Allied aircraft could threaten Japanese shipping throughout the Solomon Islands, exactly what the Japanese had hoped to prevent when they began building it. In the months that followed, the waters around Guadalcanal became the scene of a series of violent night battles. So many ships were sunk there that the area later became known as Iron Bottom Sound. Mikawa's victory did not come without cost. During the return voyage, the cruiser Kako was sunk by the American submarine S-44. But that loss did not change the outcome of the fighting on the night of August 8th and the early morning of August 9th. The Japanese Navy had won one of its greatest surface victories of the war, while the Allies had suffered one of the worst naval defeats in history. Mikawa had controlled the sea that night, but he had not retaken the island. Among the ships that left the waters around Savo Island was one that never reached its destination. Jarvis had been struck by a torpedo during the air attack on August 8th. The explosion severely damaged her bow, restricted her speed, and destroyed her radio system. That night, the destroyer passed directly across Mikawa's formation shortly before the attack began. The two sides came extremely close in the darkness, but neither opened fire. Even if the sailors aboard Jarvis recognized the ships ahead as Japanese, the destroyer no longer had any way to warn the cruisers patrolling around Savo Island. Jarvis later exchanged fire with Unagi at the edge of the battlefield, then continued alone. Without radio communications, she could not report her damage, confirm her position, or request an escort. By the morning of August 9th, Allied forces no longer knew exactly where Jarvis was. The damaged ship was attempting to leave Guadalcanal and reach a repair base when Japanese aircraft spotted her offshore. From above, the pilots misidentified her as a cruiser attempting to escape the area. The formation turned to attack. Despite her limited speed and badly damaged bow, Jarvis maneuvered to avoid the bombs and used her remaining guns to fight back. The battle was fought between a lone destroyer and a formation of aircraft, with no Allied ships or fighters close enough to intervene. Jarvis eventually disappeared with her entire crew. There were no survivors to describe exactly what happened during her final moments. Most of what is known about that last battle comes from the reports of the Japanese pilots who took part in the attack. Over 2 days around Savo Island, Jarvis had been hit, lost communications, passed through an enemy fleet without being able to send a warning, and then continued alone across the sea. No radio contact, no rescue. No one returned. Thank you for staying with the story to the end. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please support the channel by subscribing and turning on notifications so you do not miss the next one.